Good morning.
Hey, baby. Just stopping in. Thought I'd see how your day's going.
Somewhere you're not. You can't hide forever.
You've known this woman 9 days. You think you have the full picture? That footage is private.
And she was already smiling when she walked through the employee entrance. That was the thing nobody saw. The thing that happened before the customers arrived, before the registers opened, before anyone was watching. And Zara Mitchell walked in at 7:42 in the morning with a white cast running from her wrist to her elbow and a bruise along the outer edge of her left eye that makeup had mostly covered but not entirely. And she smiled at the security camera above the door, the way some people smile at a familiar face. And not because anyone was watching, because she had decided, somewhere along the way, that this was how she was going to do it. One foot and then the other. Smile first, feel it later. And she went to register 4 and unlocked the drawer, and counted her float, and got ready for the day. And nobody asked about her arm, nobody asked about her eye, and the morning crew moved around her, the way water moves around a stone, not because they didn't see it, but because seeing it required doing something about it, and doing something about it was expensive in ways that nobody in that store could afford. And she had been here 2 years. She knew exactly how it worked. 3 blocks away, in a house with too many rooms and not enough noise, Deron Ashby was standing at his kitchen counter, reading a letter written on the back of a church bulletin, and he'd been standing there since 5:15. The letter was the 4th one, 4 different envelopes, 4 different postmarks, 4 different sets of handwriting, arriving across 3 months at his corporate office. One typed on an office printer with the ink smudged on the right side like whoever sent it was left-handed and moving fast, and one in pencil pressed so hard the words nearly cut through, one on a torn piece of brown grocery bag. And this one, the one he kept returning to, written on the back of a Sunday church bulletin, in handwriting so careful it looked like the person had practiced before putting pen to paper. He had read all 4 letters more times than he could justify, and he had built a 43-store chain from a single grocery store. His grandfather left him in a neighborhood that most developers had already written off. And he had sat across from investors who told him the model wouldn't scale, bankers who told him the margins were too thin, analysts who told him the Southeast market was saturated. And he had learned early that the most important skill in any room was knowing what the numbers weren't saying. These letters were saying something the numbers weren't. Someone is being broken, and nobody is doing anything about it. That sentence, and that exact sentence in 3 of the 4 letters. And not similar phrasing, not close. Exact, like all 3 people had heard it from the same place, and it lodged somewhere they couldn't shake loose. All 4 letters named the same store. Store 18, Westbrook Mall, Atlanta, his flagship, and the location his grandfather had built from nothing in 1987, the one that still had the original sign font in the back office, because Deron had never let anyone change it, the crown jewel of everything he'd built. He could call Janice in HR, and that was the obvious move. She had protocols and checklists and a team built for exactly this kind of complaint. He could have a full report on his desk by Thursday and handle it through proper channels by Friday and move on. He read the church bulletin letter one more time, and please, before it is too late, he put it down, went to his bedroom, started looking for clothes that didn't cost what they cost, and Ashby Fresh Market number 18. Sat on the ground floor of Westbrook Mall, between a cell phone repair kiosk and a sporting goods store that appeared to have been going out of business for at least 3 consecutive years. And the mall was the kind of place built in the 80s and renovated just enough to demonstrate that someone had tried. New tile near the entrance, old tile near the back, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell regardless of how they'd actually started the day. Deron parked 3 blocks away in an old gray Civic he kept registered under his brother's address, and he walked to the mall in jeans and work boots and a faded gray jacket with a paint stain on the left sleeve from helping his cousin move apartments 4 years ago, and baseball cap pulled low. not trying to look like someone in disguise, just trying to look like nobody. He walked through the entrance at 7:52. The first thing he noticed was the silence, not the comfortable quiet of a store before the morning rush, the other kind, and the kind that had weight to it. Employees moved through the aisles with their heads down, their steps measured, their eyes on whatever was directly in front of them. Nobody made eye contact with anyone else unless they had to, and a young man in his early 20s restocked the juice aisle without looking up once. A woman near the deli counter answered a customer's question in 2 words and turned back to her work before the customer had finished saying thank you. This wasn't a crew that didn't care, and Dern had seen crews that didn't care. They looked different, looser, louder, indifferent in the way of people who had stopped trying. This was something else. These were people who had learned to make themselves small and who had decided that visibility was a liability. He'd seen that before too, just never in one of his own stores. He went to the customer service desk and told the man behind it that he was Daniel Webb, that he'd called the day before about the part-time maintenance position, and the man his name tag said Lawson. And he had the look of someone who had given up caring about anything beyond his next break, roughly 9 years ago, handed him a clipboard of forms without making eye contact, and told him to fill them out, and someone would come find him. And Disson sat down and filled out the forms with the name and address and employment history of a man who existed entirely on paper and in the patience of his brother, and who had agreed to this arrangement 4 days ago without asking too many questions, because that was the kind of brother he was. And while he wrote, he watched the floor. A woman came in with a cart and 3 children orbiting her in different directions, and she looked exhausted in the way of someone who had been exhausted for so long it had become her baseline. And a man in a postal uniform grabbed a sandwich from the deli case and counted his change twice before paying. An elderly gentleman in a blue cardigan moved through the produce section with the slow deliberation of someone who took this seriously, who understood that choosing a good tomato mattered. Normal people, doing normal things. And then behind register 4, a woman with a cast on her left arm and a bruise under her left eye was greeting every single one of them by name, and Duran stopped writing. She was saying something to the woman with the 3 children, something that made the woman's shoulders drop about 2 inches, the specific physical release of someone who had just been seen by another person after a long stretch of being invisible. And one of the children tugged at the cashier's apron, and she looked down and said something that made the child grin with the full-body commitment that only 6-year-olds can manage. She moved to the next customer and the postal worker. She asked him something he was too far away to hear it clearly, and the man's face changed the way faces change when someone remembers something about you that you mentioned in passing weeks ago and had already forgotten you'd said. And the elderly man in the blue cardigan reached the end of her line, and she held up one finger to the next customer. "Culper, just 1 second, I'm sorry," and came around the counter to help him lift his basket onto the belt. And she did it without being asked. Did it the way you do things that have become automatic, not through training, but through actually paying attention. Duran looked at the form in his lap. He'd stopped filling it out somewhere around the part where it asked for his previous employer. And Webb, he looked up. A woman was standing in front of him, mid-40s, tall clipboard held in one hand like a structural element she needed for balance. And her name tag said Tanya, floor supervisor, and she had the expression of someone who had been managing other people's problems for so long that she'd started to experience her own face as a professional liability. And "That's me," Duran said. She looked at him the way people look at minor inconveniences they've already decided how to categorize. "Zara will train you today." She pointed toward register 4 without looking at it. "Don't slow her down." And Zara Mitchell shook his hand with her right hand firm. "Quick." She was already moving back to her register because there were 2 people in line, and she wasn't the kind of person who let 2 people stand waiting while she dealt with something else. And he stood to the side and listened and tried to look like someone learning the register system when he was actually learning everything except the register system. And she walked him through the basics with the patience of someone who understood that explaining things well the first time was more efficient than explaining them twice. and she showed him how to process returns without making the customer feel like they were being suspected of something. And she explained the price override procedure clearly, and then noticing that he'd been watching her hand positioning, rather than the screen the first time through, explained it again without being asked. "And you've been here a while," he said. 2 years. Said the way people say things they've been trained to say, automatic, the edges clean. He nodded at her cast, kept his voice easy. "That looks recent." Her hands went still for half a second, then kept moving. "Stairs at home," she said, "and smooth. I'm clumsy." He didn't push. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he'd been filing things since he walked in and he watched her work. And the morning rush built steadily from 8:30 onward. Duran bagged groceries, carried out heavy items for customers who needed help, stocked a shelf in the cereal aisle that gave him a sight line to register for, and he watched Zara move through 100 small decisions, redirect a long line to another register, slow down for the elderly customer who needed more time, notice when the woman behind the postal worker was trying to manage a crying infant and a full cart simultaneously, and open the next register herself before Tanya had a chance to weigh the labor cost against the service benefit. And she knew everyone, not just their names, the details that came after the names. She asked Mrs. Patterson about her granddaughter's recital. She asked Mr. Donovan whether the reading glasses had helped, because he'd mentioned last week that his eyes were giving him trouble, and a regular named Beaumont she'd introduced him briefly. "And this is Mr. Beaumont, and he comes in every Thursday, and 91 years old." And same 6 items every time reached the front of her line, and she came around the counter to help him lift his basket without being asked, and the same way she'd done it before, and because she'd learned his specific difficulty without him ever having to name it, and she was building something, one transaction at a time, in the middle of a fluorescent-lit grocery store, in a half-renovated mall, with a broken arm and a bruise she'd covered with careful makeup. This woman was constructing a small and stubborn community of people who felt like someone knew their name. Duran watched that, and then felt something shift in his chest that hadn't moved in a while. The man in the expensive suit came in at 10:47, and Duran noticed the time because he'd just checked his watch out of habit. Board calls ran on his internal clock, even when he was pretending not to be himself, and the automatic doors slid open and the man walked through, and good suit. The kind with the lining that costs more than the jacket, phone to his ear, voice loud enough to fill the entrance. Basket grabbed without breaking stride. He worked through the store without looking at prices, and made his selections with the efficiency of someone who considered this trip beneath their attention, but was managing it anyway. He came to register 4. Put his basket on the belt, kept talking on his phone. Zara started scanning. 4 items cleared, and on the 5th a jar of pasta sauce with a damaged barcode, she said, "And I'm sorry. And I need to do a manual entry, and it'll just take a second." And the man looked at her for the first time. His eyes went to the cast, to her face, to the bruise that the makeup had mostly covered, but not entirely. And his expression moved through several things very quickly and landed on something that had decided it had found a target. "And are you serious right now?" He lowered his phone without hanging up. Like this was worth pausing for. They've got someone working the register who looks like. He made etch that included all of her. All of it. This is a high-end store. Zasa's hands went still. "And sir, I don't want an explanation from someone who can't take care of herself." He said it the way people say things when they want the room to hear, and the customer behind him took a small step back. The woman 2 people behind that had a child on her hip, and she turned slightly so the child was facing away. "Where's your manager? I want someone who can actually help me." The line went very quiet, and Duran moved before he'd finished deciding to. "Sir," he stepped up beside Zara's register, kept his voice level. The kind of level that takes practice. There's no reason to speak to her that way. And the man turned, looked at Duran the way people look at furniture that has appeared in an unexpected location. "Who are you?" "Someone who works here." "Then stay in your lane and let someone competent." "She is competent, steady. No heat in it. She's been doing her job well all morning, and you're the one creating a problem right now." The man stared at him, the stare of someone accustomed to people folding under it. Duran had spent 11 years in rooms where that stare was the primary negotiating tool. and he had developed the specific skill of standing still inside it until the other person ran out. This took about 4 seconds. And then Tanya materialized with her clipboard, and the way supervisors materialize when there is noise. And then she looked at the situation and made the calculation that people like Tanya make not which choice was right, but which choice had the least paperwork attached to it. And she looked at Zara. "Take your break early. I'll cover register 4. Something moved across Zara's face, and something that went through several expressions too fast to follow, and landed somewhere that looked like a person watching the last door close. And Tanya, I need the hours, and I can't. Now Zara." And the man watched this with the satisfied expression of someone who had achieved their objective. He didn't buy anything. He just left. Duran stood at the register and watched Zara go. He thought about the word again, and she'd used it 10 minutes ago casually, not noticing she'd used it when she mentioned Tanya writing her up. And again. Like there was a previous time, like there were several previous times, like this was a pattern she'd learned to factor into the math of her days. He didn't go after her immediately, and he went back to the cereal aisle and straightened boxes that didn't need straightening for approximately 90 seconds, while he decided what he was going to do. Then he went to the break room. She was at the small table in the back corner, staring at her hands and not crying. Past crying, maybe, or not yet ready for it, at the particular stillness that sits on either side of tears where everything just goes heavy and flat. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up. "You didn't have to do that, I know, and it won't change anything. Men like that don't change because someone talks back to them. Maybe not. But you shouldn't have to stand there and take it by yourself." And she looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since he arrived carefully, with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned that reading people accurately was a survival skill, not a personality trait. "I have 2 jobs, she said. Then stopped, shook her head slightly. "And I meant I have 1 job, but I need it as much as 2. She pressed her right hand flat on the table. "If I lose this, I don't know what I do next. And that's where I am. I hear you. You don't, actually. Not mean. Just precise. You don't know what it's like to run the math on every single day. What this shift costs if I lose it. What I have to move around if Tanya files another write-up." He held that without arguing it. "And why do you care?" she said. "You've known me for 4 hours. He thought about how to answer that. About what version of the truth fit inside the story he was still technically living. "And I had someone's close to me," he said. "She went through something, different situation, same shape. The way people looked at her or didn't. The way everyone around her kept doing exactly what they were doing and pretending not to see what was right in front of them." He paused, and it took her longer than it should have to get out because she didn't have people who made her feel like out was possible. Zara was quiet. And what happened to her? "She's okay now. She got through it." He paused, but the part that stayed with her, the part she talked about even years later, wasn't what the person did to her. It was the feeling of being invisible, and of going through it and having everyone around her act like it wasn't happening. Zara looked at the table. "That's exactly what it's like," she said, very quiet, almost to herself. "Then I want you to know you're not invisible," he said. "And not to me. Whatever else is true, that part's true." The vending machine in the corner made a series of clicking sounds that suggested it was working through something privately. "I should get back," she said. "Tanya said break. Tanya says things that aren't for my benefit." And she stood, smoothed her apron with her good hand. "Put the professional face back in place the way you put on a coat before walking into weather." At the door, she stopped. "And Daniel." He looked up. "Thank you." A pause, for stepping in, even knowing it wouldn't fix anything. "Sometimes you do it anyway," he said. She went back to the floor. He sat in the break room and listened to the vending machine and thought about the word she'd used, fix, and she had said it like a foregone conclusion. Even knowing it wouldn't fix anything, like fixing was already off the table, like she'd taken it off the table herself because leaving it on there was too expensive and he needed to know more. He called Garrett at 4 o'clock from the parking garage, sat on the hood of the Civic because the inside of the car felt too small for this conversation. Garrett Willis had been his head of security for 6 years, and before that 12 years as a private investigator out of Buckhead. Before that 8 years as an Atlanta PD detective, and he was 53 years old, and he had the pacific calm of someone who had seen most things and decided that most things weren't worth elevating his heart rate over. And he picked up on the second ring. "Talk to me. I need you to pull the employee file for Azara Mitchell, store 18, and everything you can get: performance reviews, and incident reports, and emergency contacts, and attendance records, and all of it." A pause. The kind where someone is deciding whether to say what they're thinking. "You went in," Garrett said. "Just pull the file." De Garrett. The pause stretched another 2 seconds. "Then, I'll have it in 2 hours." And he hung up, sat on the hood of the car, watched a woman load groceries into a minivan 2 spaces over while her kid ran circles around her, burning off energy sideways because there was nowhere else for it to go. And she looked tired in the way of someone for whom tired had become a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. She kept going anyway, lifted the last bag, buckled the kid in, drove away. He drove home and ate rice and beans from a container standing at the kitchen counter. The 4 letters sat in a stack where he'd left them that morning. He'd meant to put them away and hadn't. At 6:48, Garrett called. "Short version first," Duran said. 6 incident reports, and 18 months. All signed by Tanya Brooks, floor supervisor. None escalated to regional management, none flagged to HR. A pause. "The emergency contact on file is the same person listed as the witness on all 6 reports." And Duran put down the container. "Devon Hale," Garrett said, listed as boyfriend, no criminal record on paper, works as a construction project manager in Midtown, earns well, presents well. 2 previous long-term relationships on record, and both ended with the women filing police reports that were subsequently withdrawn. Both women relocated out of state within 60 days of withdrawing. The kitchen was quiet. "The incident reports," Duran said. "What do they say?" "That's what I want you to hear," Garrett said. "And the documented injuries, the locations on her body, the time intervals between incidents." He stopped. "This isn't a woman who's accident-prone. This is a documented pattern, and someone in that store has been signing off on it for a year and a half." And Duran looked at the stack of letters on the counter, the church bulletin on top, the careful handwriting. "Please, before it is too late, keep going on Devon Hale," he said, "and financial history, and prior legal matters, and associates, and anything that isn't visible on the surface. And I want to know what this man looks like when nobody was." "And the store situation?" "I'll handle the store." He hung up, stood at the counter for a long moment. Then he went to the bedroom and opened the drawer of the nightstand and took out an old photograph, and the edges had gone soft from handling. His mother, Loretta, in the backyard of the house they'd lived in when he was a teenager. She was laughing at something off camera, the full-face laugh of someone genuinely caught off guard by something delightful. And he could tell you exactly when this picture was taken. And 2 weeks after the night, he stood in the hallway outside the kitchen and listened and did nothing, and told himself there was nothing a 14-year-old could do, which was partially true and had been the story he'd carried forward ever since. He looked at his mother's face and at the laugh that had come back even after everything. He had spent 30 years telling himself that laugh proved she'd been fine, and that the doing nothing had been survivable, so it had essentially been okay. Sitting at the edge of his bed with the photograph in his hands, he understood for the first time with any real clarity that survivable and okay were not the same place. And he put the photograph in the breast pocket of his jacket, right over his chest where he'd feel it. Set his offer for 5:45. The second day he arrived at 7:15, and Tanya assigned him to the cereal aisle, and the aisle ran parallel to the register bank, with a clear sightline to register 4, and which was not an accident on his part, and though he'd framed it as still learning the layout, and wherever you need me. And Zara came in at 7:42 on time, and he would learn she was almost always on time, and except for 4 documented instances in the incident reports, and all of which coincided with the other documented accidents, and all of which Tanya had marked as unexcused without notation, and she went to her register. Put her things in the drawer below the counter keys, a small bag, a paperback he couldn't read the title of from this distance. Then she looked up and moved her gaze across the store, the way someone checks a room for the thing they're afraid of. Quick and practiced. Already automatic. She checked, found nothing that concerned her, let out a breath so small you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Then she saw him, and then something in her shoulders came down a fraction of an inch. He nodded. She nodded back, went to work. And he spent the morning watching her and thinking about 43 stores and about how many people were behind, how many registers right now doing some version of this, holding something together with both hands, and one of them broken, and how many of them had 6 unsigned incident reports in a folder that had never reached the 38th floor. And at noon they took their breaks at the same time, which he'd arranged by asking Tanya to shift his 15 minutes later so he could finish a section he was stocking, and Tanya had agreed because it made her numbers look better. He brought coffee, and from the place 2 blocks east that roasted their own beans and had a line out the door at 6:45. And he didn't know how she took hers, so he brought a container of cream and 3 sugar packets and felt mildly ridiculous about it. The entire walk from the coffee shop to the mall, and he set the cup on the table across from her, added the cream and sugar packets in a small pile. She looked at the pile, looked at him. "I didn't know how you took it," he said. She took the cream, used half, 1 sugar, and stirred with the little wooden stick he'd saved from the bag without thinking about why he was saving it. She took a sip, said nothing, but something in how she held herself moved differently for the rest of that break. And, "Tell me about this neighborhood," he said. She looked up. "Why? I'm new. I don't know anything about it. And you clearly know everyone who comes through that door." She considered him. That careful assessment she'd had since day one, the one that was still calculating something. "And Westbrook has been changing," she said. "Not in ways that help the people who've been here longest. The new buildings on 7th are renting at 3 times what they were 6 years ago, and most of my regulars have moved further out. They still come here because it's familiar, because somebody knows their name." A pause. "Because at some point this register became one of the few things in their week that stayed the same." He was quiet. "That's a real answer," he said. "And you asked a real question." They drank their coffee. "The break room hummed. Your sister," he said. "You mentioned her once." Something shifted in her face. "And just slightly, Charlotte. She's finishing her last year of college." A pause. "She calls every Sunday. We talk for 20 minutes before she has to go somewhere." She looked at her cup. "She's almost out. I don't mean out of school, and I mean she's almost at the part where her life is fully hers, where she gets to just be in it without anything dragging at her." Something in her voice. Not quite wistful, more like witnessing. "And that's good. I want that for her." "You sound like you're working very hard to mean that." Then something loosened. "I do mean it," she said. "I also miss her. Those 2 things are both true." "Yeah," he said. "They usually are." She looked at her coffee cup, and he looked at his. The vending machine clicked through something private in the corner. "Then," she said, "you almost said a different name. And before, when you introduced yourself, you started to say something else." He kept his face neutral. "Sleep deprivation. Long night." She watched him for a moment. "Okay," she said, and let it go, but she filed it away. He could see that she did, and because she was the kind of person who noticed things, and he was sitting across from her, noticing that she noticed, and somewhere in that exchange, something shifted between them that neither of them named, and she went back to the floor. He sat in the break room a few minutes longer and thought about what he'd seen in 2 days. Not just Zara, the whole store, the way employees moved, and the particular way Tanya held her clipboard, like it was the only thing between her and something she didn't want to think about. The way Noel at Register 3 had watched the scene with the rude customer the day before, and then looked carefully away, and the whole ecosystem of people who had learned that not seeing was safer than seeing. He thought about his grandfather, Roosevelt Ashby, who had opened the first store because the neighborhood needed somewhere to buy food from someone who knew their name, and who had said once, when Duran was 12 and helping stock shelves on a Saturday, that a store wasn't a building, it was an agreement. "We'll be here. You can count on us." He thought about the agreement he'd made with 43 buildings worth of people, and whether he was actually keeping it. Garrett's call came at 6:48. Duran was at home, same counter, different container of food. "You want it all at once or in pieces?" "All at once," Garrett breathed. Devon Hale has been in 3 long-term relationships in 8 years, and Zara is the 3rd. The pattern is identical in all 3 financial control established within 6 months. Systematic isolations from support systems, incidents documented as accidents with the partner listed as concerned witness, and he paused. I spoke to someone who spoke to the sister of the Birmingham woman. Devon builds a counter-narrative in advance, keeps records of anything that could look like instability attendance issues, medical visits, workplace incidents, and he constructs the story before she has a chance to tell hers. The kitchen was quiet. He has a signed document from Zara, Garrett continued. I don't have it, but I know it exists. Obtained after she tried to leave once, and standard move, apparently. She signs it or something worse happens to her. It recants the abuse claims, frames her as the unstable party. Can it be challenged? Coerced documents can be challenged. You need to prove coercion, and he'd have made sure there were no witnesses. And a pause. Duron. This man is not losing control. He is controlling. Those are completely different problems. He looked at the letters on the counter, the church bulletin, before it is too late, and someone had pressed hard enough writing that line that he could feel the indent on the back of the paper. Keep building, he said. I need the full picture, everything. How long are you planning to stay in that store? Until I know what we're dealing with. And then, and he pressed his hand flat against his jacket pocket, over the photograph. Over the image of his mother laughing in a backyard 2 weeks after an injury nobody had asked about. And then we deal with it, he said. He hung up, set his alarm for 5:45 again. Because tomorrow he was going back, and the day after that, and he was going to keep going back until he understood everything the numbers weren't saying. And until the woman at Register 4 knew, with the kind of certainty that could hold weight, that she was not invisible, not to him, not anymore. The third day, Duron brought better coffee, and not from the break room machine, which appeared to operate on a philosophy of doing the minimum required to qualify as coffee and nothing more, and from the place 2 blocks east that had a line out the door at 6:45 because they took it seriously and charged accordingly, and he bought 2 cups, black, and a small container of cream and 3 sugar packets in case she took it the same way as yesterday, and which she did. And he walked the 3 blocks to the mall in the early morning cold, feeling mildly purposeful, and not entirely sure what he was doing, and she was already at Register 4 when he came in, and he set the cup on the edge of her counter without saying anything. She looked at it, looked at him, and he put the cream beside it, and the sugar packets in a small stack, and she took the cream without comment and used exactly half of it, and 1 sugar, and stirred with the wooden stick he'd saved again from the bag, because apparently this was a habit now. She took a sip and said nothing. But something in her shoulders moved differently for the first hour of the morning, and less braced. Not relaxed, he didn't think relaxed was a mode she had access to at work, but something 1 degree removed from the constant readiness she usually carried. He went to his assigned section, watched the floor, watched her, and on the 4th day she brought him something back. He found it on the break room table during the lunch hour. A small container with a snap lid, his name written on a piece of tape on the top in careful handwriting. And inside was rice, and what turned out to be the best black-eyed peas he'd eaten in years, seasoned with something he couldn't identify and didn't want to question. And he sat down and ate it, and thought about the fact that she had made this at home, in whatever time she had between the end of her shift and the beginning of the next day, and brought it for someone she'd known for 4 days. He thought about what that cost her, and not in money. In the other ways, things cost people. When she came in for her afternoon break, he said, "You didn't have to do that. I know," she said, and opened her own container, and they ate without making a big thing of it. That was the 4th day, and by the 5th day, they had something that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite anything else but occupied its own territory between those 2 things. She told him about a regular named Miss and Beaumont and his Thursday routine in enough detail that Duron felt he could have picked the man out of a crowd. And she told him about the cell phone repair guy 2 storefronts over who always bought the same peanut butter crackers and always paid in exact change that he counted out while making the crackers wait. And she said it with the particular affection of someone who found human ritual genuinely interesting rather than annoying. And she asked him about his work history, and he gave her the version he'd prepared: construction, some warehouse work, a few years managing a small property in Macon before the owner sold it. She listened the way she listened to everything, with full attention, which he had come to understand was not a performance, and it was just how she processed the world. She didn't push, didn't ask the follow-up questions that would have unraveled things. Either she believed him entirely, or she had decided, for reasons of her own, that she wasn't ready to pull on that particular thread yet, and he wasn't sure which. He thought about it in the car on the way home the 5th night and still wasn't sure. Garrett called at 7. I found the Memphis woman. Duran pulled over, put the car in park on a residential street in the dark. I didn't contact her, Garrett said. Not yet, but I found her. She's in Phoenix, been there for 4 years. She works as an office manager for an insurance company. She has a daughter, 8 years old, and a pause. Before she left Memphis, she filed 3 police reports against Devin Hale. Each one escalated in severity. And then one day all 3 were withdrawn and she was gone. What made her withdraw? I don't know yet, but I know the pattern. And Garrett's voice had the particular flatness he used when the information was heavy. The Birmingham woman did the same thing. Filed, withdrew, gone within 60 days. And before both of them left, they signed something. And the document. A version of it, yes. I think he adjusts it by situation. What the specific woman has that he can use against her. What the specific threat needs to be to make her sign. He paused. With Zara, I don't know what he used. But given that she came back after leaving once, and given the time frame, my best guess is he threatened something involving her sister. Duran sat in the dark on the residential street, and someone was walking a dog 2 houses down. The dog stopped at every tree with the thoroughness of a professional. The Birmingham woman's sister, Duran said. You spoke to her, briefly. Generally, she wouldn't go on record, but she said Devin kept documentation on all of them, and everything that could be made to look like instability. Medical visits, workplace incidents. He was building the file while he was in the relationship. Garrett paused. Duran. The incident reports that Tanya signed, and he has copies. You're certain? I'm certain he'd have made copies. I can't prove it yet, but men who operate this way don't leave the documentation only in one place they don't control. He looked out the windshield at the dark street. What else? And I'm still pulling his financial records. There's something in there that doesn't line up, some transfers I can't account for yet. I'll have more by morning. He drove home, stood at the kitchen counter, and read back through the notes he'd been keeping, and not on his phone, where they'd sync to his corporate accounts, and in a small notebook he'd bought at the drugstore near the hotel, and the kind with the black and white composition cover that had always made him feel, and since childhood, and like whatever was written inside it was more serious than other writing. And he looked at what he had. 6 incident reports. A documented pattern across 3 relationships, a signed document obtained under threat. An isolated woman with no nearby family and a controlled bank account and a supervisor who had been looking away for 18 months. And he thought about Zara saying, I have 1 job, but I need it as much as 2. He thought about her using the word again without noticing she'd used it. He thought about the way she moved her gaze across the room every morning when she came in. Quick, practiced, and checking for the things she was afraid of. He put the notebook down, called his mother. Loretta answered on the 3rd ring, same as always. Not the first, because she had a philosophy about appearing to have been waiting, even when she had been. And baby, her voice, unchanged since he was 14 and probably unchanged since before that. It's you sound like you're sitting in a car somewhere thinking too hard. I'm at the kitchen counter. Same thing, he almost smiled. Mama, I need to ask you something. Ask it. When you were in it, and when things were bad. He stopped, started again. Was there ever anyone who knew? Who could see it from the outside? Loretta was quiet for a moment, and not the quiet of not knowing. The quiet of deciding how much to say. There were people who suspected, she said. Neighbors, one of the women from church. A pause. Nobody said anything. Why not? Because it's hard, she said. It costs someone to say something. And people are tired, and they have their own lives. She paused. I'm not saying it to excuse them. I'm saying it because it's true. Were you angry at them? And I was. And then I wasn't, because I understood eventually that the anger was easier to carry than what was underneath it. What was underneath it? The wish that someone had just looked directly at me, she said. Not at the situation. At me, and then decided I was worth the cost of saying something. He sat with that. Why are you asking me this, Duran? I'm working on something, he said. And there's a woman. She's in something she can't get out of alone. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then you already know what you need to do, she said. You've known since you were 14 years old. You just didn't have the tools then. He said goodnight. and sat at the kitchen counter for a while after. Then he went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about what she'd said. You just didn't have the tools then, and he had the tools now. The question was whether he was going to use them. Devon Hale walked into store 18 at 11:43 on a Wednesday. Duran was in the household goods aisle, which ran perpendicular to the register bank and gave him a partial view of the entrance. And he saw Devon come through the automatic doors, and his body registered something before his mind had caught up. A heightening, a sharpening of attention. The specific alertness of someone who had spent days looking at a photograph and was now looking at the subject of it in motion, and the DMV photo had given him the dimensions. 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, the build of someone who had been athletic young and had maintained it through discipline rather than enjoyment. What the photo hadn't given him was the quality of how Devon moved. Easy, and the ease of a man who had never once walked into a room and felt uncertain about his place in it. He picked up a basket from the stack near the entrance, moved into the produce section, and his eyes moved across the store without appearing to search, the way people's eyes move when they already know where everything is. He knew this store. He had been here before, and Duran set down the box he was holding and moved to the end of the aisle, keeping a display between himself and Eitlans. Devon moved through produce without selecting anything, moved into the snack aisle, put chips and water into his basket without reading labels, and then he turned into the household section, the small corner near the back, that stocked basic hardware and cleaning supplies, and began moving through it slowly. And he picked up a roll of duct tape, set it in the basket, picked up a pack of zip ties, the kind sold for cable management, 25 to a pack, set them in the basket, picked up a box cutter with a retractable blade, set it in the basket. Then he walked to register 4. And Duran watched Zara see him coming from 20 feet away. He watched her face do what it did arrange itself, close things down, bring the professional surface up like storm shutters before weather, and she did it in 2 seconds, faster than she should have been able to do something like that, which meant she had done it many times. Devon put his items on the belt. He placed them deliberately, not quickly, not carelessly, and one at a time with the careful placement of someone who wanted each object to be seen. The duct tape, the zip ties, the box cutter. Zara scanned them. Her hand was steady. He had to give her that, and whatever was happening inside her, her hand was steady on the scanner. He could see the effort it cost from 30 feet away. Devon leaned against the counter. Hey, baby. Quiet. Conversational. The voice of someone talking to a person who belonged to them. Just stopping in, and thought I'd see how your day's going. It's going fine. Her eyes on the screen. $14.87. Devon paid. Cash, folded bills from his jacket pocket. You look tired. And he took the bag. Didn't move away from the counter. You should come home early, get some rest. I have hours left in my shift, I know. He smiled. It was a genuinely good smile, the kind that worked on people. I'm just saying, if you wanted to. He let it sit there. And the offer that wasn't an offer, I don't want to. 1 second. 2, 3. Okay, he said, easy, unbothered, like it hadn't mattered at all. And he picked up his bag. As he turned to go, his eyes moved down the household goods aisle and found Duran. 3 seconds of eye contact, no confusion in it, no uncertainty. The look of a man who had already done his research and was now confirming something he'd already concluded. And then Devon's gaze moved on. He walked to the exit. The automatic doors closed behind him. Duran stood at the end of the aisle and did not move for a moment, and 3 seconds was enough. He'd learned a lot about Devon Hale in the past 5 days, and one thing he'd learned was that 3 seconds of eye contact from a man like Devon was not casual. It was communication. Clean and deliberate. The way everything Devon did was deliberate, and he knew who Duran was. Or he was very close to knowing, close enough to send a message with his eyes across a grocery store. Duran pulled out his phone, texted Garrett, and Devon was just in the store. He bought duct tape, zip ties, box cutter, left them with Zara. Eye contact on the way out. He may know who I am. 3 dots. How certain on the eye contact? Certain. A pause longer than the previous ones. I'll start moving on contingencies. And how long do you need? He looked down the store toward register 4. Zara was already with her next customer, performing normal, both hands working, somewhere underneath that, bracing. And give me until end of week, he typed. That may be optimistic. I know. Darren, I know, Garrett. He put his phone away. went back to the household goods section, picked up the box he'd set down and put it on the shelf and started making a different kind of plan. And the security alarm went off the next day at 11:15. And the intercom voice was calm and recorded, and clearly designed to convey that this was a precautionary measure, and not a reason to panic, which had the effect of making roughly half the customers look like they were considering panicking. And all exits sealed. Remain where you are. Thank you for your patience. And Tanya appeared with her clipboard and announced that the store would remain open and employees should continue serving customers, and which was the policy. And Daron suspected, and the only mode Tanya knew how to operate in. And he looked toward Register 4. Zara had stopped moving. Not the professional stillness she deployed between customers. Something else. And she was holding the edge of her counter with her good hand, and her breathing had changed. He could see it from here. The shallow rise and fall of someone whose body had made a decision without consulting them. And he crossed to her register. Take a break, he said quietly. I can't, I'll handle Tanya. And he said it without thinking about whether he could back it up as Daniel Webb and maintenance worker. And then she must have heard something in his voice that made her not question it. And because she nodded and picked up her small bag and went. And he found her in the break room 10 minutes later when Tanya finally agreed to cover Register 4, which she did with the expression of someone performing a significant personal sacrifice. And Zara was at the corner table. Same table, same position as the first day, hands on flat, eyes down, breathing carefully. He sat across from her. They stayed like that for a moment. Outside, the store continued its muffled operation, and the vending machine worked through something private. Being locked in places, she said. Not an explanation, just something she put in the room between them. I know, he said. She looked up. You can't know, not the way you know it. And he met her eyes, but I understand why it would do this to you. She breathed, in through her nose, out slowly again. He locks the bedroom door, she said. From the outside, he installed a bolt. He says it's so I can think clearly. She looked at her hands, and the longest was overnight. I missed work the next day. I told Tanya I was sick. He said nothing. I found a camera in the apartment 8 months ago, she said, and small one, near the kitchen. I don't know if there are others. When I found it, I didn't say anything, because saying something meant he'd know I'd found it. She paused, so I just kept living with it, knowing it was there. Zara. She kept going, and like something had opened and needed to finish opening before it could close again. I tried to leave once, she said. I went to my sister, in Charlotte. I took 2 bags and I got on a bus, and I thought if I could just get far enough. And she stopped. 3 days later, he was at Brianna's door. Flowers. He'd been in therapy, he said. He understood what he'd done. Losing me had changed everything. Her voice was flat and precise, the voice of a correspondent reporting from a place they've left, and he was very convincing. He always is. Did Brianna believe him? She wanted to. She's 22. She believes in the version of people that shows up with flowers. A pause. He told her I'd been struggling, and that I'd been making things up because of stress, that he was worried about me. She looked at her cast. I went back. 3 weeks later, he told me the whole thing had been a performance, that he'd needed to get us back to where we needed to be. Her hand moved to the cast, and after that, he had me sign something. He kept his voice level. What kind of something? A document, a written statement. And she said it like she was still slightly outside herself about it. It said I'd fabricated the abuse, that I'd been mentally unstable, that the accidents had been my fault, and I'd blamed him because I was erratic and needed help. She paused. He had it ready when he came to get me, and either I signed it or he was calling the police to report. I'd taken myself away without his consent, which he had documentation to support because he always has documentation to support everything. And she looked at her hands. His lawyer friend was on the phone. I signed. He thought about Garrett's voice. He's not losing control. He is controlling. He has copies of the incident reports from this store, Daron said carefully. The ones Tanya signed off on. She looked at him, and, not surprised, I figured. He'll use them if you try to leave again. I know. She looked at the table. 6 documented workplace incidents, all describing me as unstable or accident-prone, all signed by a supervisor, and, combined with the document I signed, combined with whatever else he's been keeping. She said it like someone reading a hand they'd already lost. He's been building this longer than I realized. The camera footage, Daron said slowly. She looked up. And if the camera has been running in the apartment for months, he said, it's documented more than just you. Something moved in her face, cautious. Not yet hope, something smaller than hope, the thing that comes before hope, the opening through which hope might eventually pass. And he'd never let anyone in see it, she said. He doesn't have to let anyone. She stared at him. Daniel, who are you? The question sat between them in the lockdown break room, with the vending machine clicking and the muffled sounds of the store outside the door. He looked at her, and at the woman who remembered every customer's name and made food at home to bring for a coworker she'd known less than a week and had been surviving an unsurvivable situation with both hands for longer than anyone in this building had bothered to look at directly. And someone who can help you more than I've told you, he said. She held his gaze. That's not an answer. I know. He paused. I'm working up to the answer. How long does that take? I'm hoping not much longer. She looked at him for a long moment, and the assessment she'd been running since day one, still running, recalculating against this new data point. Okay, she said, very quiet. And he didn't know if she meant okay she'd wait, or okay she understood, or okay she was choosing to extend something she hadn't extended to many people in a long time. And maybe all three. The intercom announced that the lockdown had been lifted. Exits were reopened. Thank you for your patience. Normal operations resumed. Zara stood, straightened her apron, picked up her bag. At the door, she paused, didn't turn around. The camera, she said. And in the kitchen. It's a white square, about 2 inches. There's a small blue light on the bottom left corner. She went back to the floor. He sat for a moment. Then he texted Garrett, and Devon installed a camera in her apartment. Running for at least 8 months. Cloud backup likely. White square unit. Blue indicator light. Find the system. The response came in 4 minutes. On it. Devon called that night, and Daron was at home, and at the counter, and not eating anything, and just standing in the kitchen because sitting felt wrong. And his phone rang from an unknown number, and something told him to answer it, and he did. Silence for 2 seconds. Then, interesting hobby. And the voice was even. Conversational. The voice of a man who felt no urgency about this particular conversation because he believed the outcome was already established. I've done some reading, Devon said. Daron Ashby. Built something real from nothing. That's a good story, and I respect the work. A pause. I followed you from the mall Tuesday night. Nice hotel for a maintenance worker. The car was even more interesting. Daron said nothing. I'm not angry, Devon said, and I want you to understand that. I'm a reasonable man. I think you saw something that caught your attention and you acted on it because you're the kind of person who acts on things. I can respect that. A pause, the specific pause of someone deploying a tone, but you've gotten close enough to see that this is complicated. Zara has a history of this, of finding men who want to help her and then letting that help create problems for everyone. And is that right? Daron said. There's a document, Devon said. She wrote it herself. I can send it to you. It explains the pattern better than I can. A brief pause. I also have footage from the store, break room, the two of you. And nothing happened, I know that, but context is everything, isn't it? A CEO spending unsupervised time with a vulnerable employee. The way that gets written depends entirely on how it's framed. Daron looked at the 4 letters on the counter. And, what do you want? He said. I want you to remember that you built something, Devon said. 43 stores. Your grandfather's name on all of them. That's worth protecting. A pause. Walk away from this. Go back to your floor. And let Zara and me work through our situation the way couples work through situations. You broke her arm, Daron said. Twice. Silence. Long enough to mean something. Zara has fragile bones, Devon said finally. The ease was still in his voice, but something underneath it had moved. And just slightly. It's documented by you. By her doctors. Doctors who heard the story you told. Another silence. Walk away, Mr. Ashby. The tone had shifted, still controlled, but the conversational warmth was gone. And this is the part where you decide whether what you've seen is worth what it'll cost you. What will it cost me, Daron said. Everything moves slower when someone's pouring sand in the gears, Devon said. Permits, zoning reviews, supply chain inquiries. And a company this size has a lot of gears. Are you threatening my business? I'm describing how the world works, Devon said. I know people. I have relationships. I'm not making threats. I'm making observations. A pause. And the video goes to 3 journalists by morning if I don't hear from you. That's also an observation. He hung up. Duran set his phone on the counter, stood very still for a moment. Then he called Garrett. "Devin called me," he said. "He confirmed he knows who I am. He has a video from the store break room, the lockdown footage. He says he'll send it to journalists if I don't walk away." He also implied he has connections that could create regulatory complications for the chain. And Garrett was quiet for 2 seconds. "What do you want to do?" "I want you to tell me about the camera system." A pause. The sound of Garrett pulling up something. "I've identified it, and it's a residential surveillance unit mid-range, and yes, it backs up automatically to a cloud account. The account is registered in Devin's name. 14 months of footage. 14 months, Garrett. And if there's a way to get a legitimate legal process around that account." "I've been thinking about the same thing," Garrett said. "There's a civil case. 3 years ago. Devin was a character witness, and I have reason to believe he had private contact with another witness in that case after testimony. And that's potentially criminal witness intimidation. If I can get a DA interested in reopening the inquiry, a records request for Devin's accounts becomes legitimate and defensible. How long? To get a DA interested. If I have the right contact, 48 hours. And what's the right contact?" "I have someone," Garrett said. "Let me make the call, make it tonight. And the video Devin has, the break room footage." Duran looked at the letters on the counter, and the church bulletin on top. "Let him send it," he said. "Silence. If he sends it," Duran said, "I address it publicly. All of it, why I was there, what I found, what's been happening to an employee in one of my stores for 18 months. And that means Devin's entire operation becomes public record. That exposes Zara, not if she's protected before it happens." He paused. "How long to get protection in place? And if the DA moves on the records request, and we can get law enforcement involved 48 hours from when I make the call. And then we have 48 hours. He paused. "But I need to tell her first. Before any of this moves, she needs to hear it from me." Garrett didn't say anything for a moment. "That's the right call," he said. "I know it is." He paused. "It's also the hard one. Usually the same thing." And he hung up, stood at the counter, looked at the photograph in his jacket pocket, which he'd moved to the counter when he got home and hadn't put back yet, and his mother's face, the laugh, the backyard. He thought about what she'd said on the phone. "You already know what to do. You just didn't have the tools then." He picked the photograph up, put it back in his jacket pocket, over his chest, and where he'd feel it in the morning when he drove to the mall and found Zara before her shift started and told her the truth about who he was. All of it. Whatever came after that, he would deal with, but she was going to hear it from him. Before anything else moved. That was the one thing he was certain about. He found her in the parking lot at 7:10. She was sitting in her car with the engine running and her phone in her lap, and she wasn't looking at the phone. And she was looking at the middle distance the way people look when they're not seeing anything outside themselves. When he pulled up 2 spaces over and got out, she watched him walk toward her, and something in her face went careful, and he stopped at her window. She rolled it down. The morning was cold, that specific November cold that Atlanta got sometimes, the kind that felt more serious than the season usually warranted, like the temperature was making a point. "Before you go in," he said. She looked at him and waited. He had thought about how to do this on the drive over, had gone through several versions of how to begin, and had decided in the end that there was no version that was better than another, and that the only thing that mattered was saying it clearly, without managing it, without shaping it into something easier to receive than it actually was. "And my name is Daron Ashby," he said, "not Daniel Webb. Daniel Webb doesn't exist. And I built this chain from a single store my grandfather left me, and I own all 43 locations, including this one. And I came here because I received anonymous letters about what was happening in this store. I needed to see it myself." She didn't move. "And I've been here 9 days as someone I'm not," he said. "I had Garrett, my head of security, pull your employee file on the 2nd day, and I've known about the incident reports and Devin's pattern and the document you signed since day 3. I should have told you before now. I didn't, because I was trying to protect the access, and I told myself that was for good reasons, and it was partly true, and partly not, and the engine was still running, warm air coming out of the vents. Outside, the parking lot was filling slowly as the morning shift arrived. Zazra was very still, and Devin called me last night," Daron said. "He knows who I am. He has footage from the store break room, from the lockdown. He told me to walk away or he sends it to journalists and makes what happened between us look like something it wasn't. He paused, and he also implied he has connections that could cause problems for my business. She looked at him for a long time. Say something, he said. I'm thinking, she said. He waited, and she looked out the windshield at the parking lot, at the mall entrance, at the door she'd walked through 5 days a week for 2 years. You lied to me from the first day, she said. Not a question. Yes. And you sat across from me in that break room, and let me tell you things I've never told anyone. Yes. And the whole time you had a file on me. You knew things about my situation that I hadn't told you. And yes. She turned and looked at him directly. How is that different from him? He'd known that question was coming. Had known it since about day 4, when he'd understood clearly enough what he was doing to understand also what it looked like. It's not entirely different, he said, and I told myself the deception was in service of something good, that I needed the access to understand what was really happening. That telling you too soon would compromise the investigation, and he paused. Devon probably tells himself something similar, that what he does is for good reasons, that the control is protection. She held his gaze. The difference, he said, is that I'm telling you now, not because I need something from you in this moment, and not to manage you toward a decision I've already made, because you deserve to know the truth about who you've been talking to, and because I'm about to ask you to trust me with something real, and I can't do that while I'm still pretending to be someone I'm not. And silence. A car pulled into the space beside hers, an employee he recognized from the afternoon shift, coming in early for some reason, who glanced at them and went inside without stopping. What are you asking me to trust you with? Zara said. Your safety, he said, and the next 48 hours. And the possibility that this ends differently than you think it can. She looked at him. Garrett has identified the camera system Devon installed in your apartment, Duran said, and it backs up to a cloud account registered in Devon's name. 14 months of footage. Garrett has a path to access it through a legitimate legal process. There's a prior case, a witness intimidation angle that gives a D-Day grounds for a records request. He paused. And if that footage shows what I think it shows, Devon loses the one thing he's been counting on. The counter-narrative he built. The version of events where you're the unstable one, and he's the concerned partner, and something moved in her face. Small, careful. He'll still have the document I signed, she said. A coerced document obtained under threat of arrest can be challenged, especially with evidence of the coercion pattern, especially with the footage. He paused. And there are also 2 women before you. One in Memphis, one in Birmingham. Both of them went through the same thing. Garrett has found them. She looked at the steering wheel. They won't talk, she said. They never talk. And they left because talking wasn't safe. Garrett hasn't contacted them yet. He wanted to wait until there was something real to offer them. Not just a request to relive something terrible. An actual path. He paused. He's going to ask them if they want this to end differently, and for them and for whoever comes after you. Zara was quiet for a long time. The engine ran. The heat came through the vents. What do you need from me? She said finally. And tonight don't go home, he said. Go somewhere Devon doesn't know about. A hotel, anything. I'll handle the cost. Garrett will coordinate with law enforcement through the night, and by tomorrow morning we'll have enough to move. She looked at him. And if I don't go home, he'll know something's happening. Yes, and when he knows, that's why it has to be tonight. Before he has time to respond to knowing, she breathed, in and out, the visible breath in the cold air. And Brianna, she said, I'll make sure Garrett has her number. If Devon tries to reach her to get to you, we'll be ahead of it. She looked at the mall entrance again, at the door. You've been planning this, she said, not accusing, just recognizing. Since the night he called me, Duran said. Yes, and if it doesn't work, then I go public with everything I know, regardless of what it costs me, and the incident reports, and the pattern, and the letters I received, and all of it. And Devon wants to send a video to journalists. I'll send a press release that gives them a better story. He met her eyes. I'd rather do this the careful way, the way that protects you and builds the strongest case. But if it comes down to it, I will burn down everything he's built to keep you safe. That's not a figure of speech. She looked at him for a long moment. He thought about what Garrett had said, and that's the right call. It's also the hard one. When I went to Brianna's that time, Zara said slowly, and he came to get me, the thing that made me go back wasn't the flowers. It wasn't even the threat. She paused. And it was that I looked at Brianna's face, and I saw how much she wanted to believe things could be okay. And I thought if I fight this, and I lose, she has to watch me lose. And she's 22 years old, and I'm her whole family nearby, and I couldn't make her watch me lose. You won't lose, Daron said. You can't promise that. No, he said. I can't, but I can tell you that this time you won't be the only one fighting. He paused. And you've been alone in this for too long. You don't have to be alone in it now. She looked at the steering wheel, at her cast, at her hands, and then she looked at him and said, okay, one word, but the weight of it. He nodded. I'll text you the hotel information. Check in under your name, it'll be covered. Call Brianna tonight. She reached down and turned off the engine. Daron, she said. His name, and his real name. First time she'd said it. Yeah, thank you for telling me the truth. She opened the car door. Even if it took you too long. She walked toward the mall entrance, and he stood in the parking lot and watched her go and then called Garrett. We move tonight, he said. Understood, Garrett said. I'll make the call to the DA contact now. Tanya Brooks came to find him at 9:15, and he was in the manager's office, the actual manager's office, and which the current store manager, and a man named Philip who had been notified the previous afternoon that the company founder would be using the space, and had vacated with the particular combination of confusion and professionalism of someone who understood that some situations didn't require full explanation. And Tanya knocked, came in. She had her clipboard, same as always, but she was holding it differently. Not like a structural element she needed for balance. Like something she wasn't sure what to do with. And like she'd carried it so long she didn't know how to walk without it, but wasn't sure it was doing anything useful anymore. She sat down across from him without being asked. Put the clipboard on the table, put a manila envelope beside it, and pressed both hands flat on the envelope, the way you press your hands on something you've been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. And I've been here 17 years, she said. I know, Daron said. I want you to understand that before anything else. 17 years. I built the floor operations in this store from 4 people. I know every policy in that manual. And I've hired and trained more employees than I can count. She looked at her hands on the envelope, and for the last 18 months I have been signing documents I knew were wrong. He waited. Devin came to me before it escalated to what it is now, she said, and he came in like a concerned boyfriend. Said Zara had been struggling. Mental health issues, he said. He wanted to make sure she kept her job because the stability would help her. And he said if anything happened, incidents, attendance problems, he wanted to be kept informed as her emergency contact. She paused. I didn't agree exactly. I just stopped asking questions. Every time something happened, I wrote it up the way he'd framed it. Clumsy, accident-prone, unstable, and he had something on you, Daron said. She looked up. How did you know? Because you're not a cruel person, he said. Rigid, maybe risk-averse, but not cruel. People who are just cruel don't need leverage. I was quiet for a moment. Early in my time here, she said, and there was a situation with inventory. I made a decision I shouldn't have made, and I covered it up instead of reporting it. Nothing criminal, but the kind of thing that ends a career if it surfaces. And she paused. Devin found out. I don't know how. He never threatened me directly. He just made sure. I knew that he knew, and then he waited, and I made my own choices about what that meant. He let you do the work for him, Daron said. Yes, she said it flatly, and the word of someone who has spent a long time not saying something, and has finally said it, and is now just left with the truth of it, and he never had to pressure me. I pressured myself. She slid the envelope across the table. Everything, she said. The original incident reports before I amended them. I have photographs I took at the time. I don't know why I took them. Self-protection, maybe. Habit. But I kept them. And she paused. There are emails. Devin used the store's vendor inquiry address. He figured it out somehow to tell me what to write on each report and what to leave out. And I printed everyone. I don't know why I printed them either. He opened the envelope. The original reports were on top. The language before it had been softened, before the word accident had been inserted into places where it didn't belong. Clear, clinical, and the documentation of a person who had been watching something happen and writing down what she actually saw, even as she was being told to write something else. Underneath, the photographs, and taken on a phone, slightly blurry in the way of pictures taken quickly in difficult circumstances, and clear enough. Underneath those, the emails. Printed on regular paper, the ink slightly faded. Devon's instructions in the subject line dressed as operational questions about inventory or scheduling. The actual instructions in the body. He looked at them for a long moment. "And Tanya," he said, "why now?" She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "And yesterday evening. And after Devon called me, he wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual, and if Zara had said anything, and if there were any other men she'd been talking to." I went back to the floor after I hung up, and I stood at the end of the aisle, and I looked at Register 4. She paused. It was empty because Zara had already gone for the day. And I stood there looking at the empty register, and I thought about 17 years, about all the things I'd decided not to see, and she looked at her hands. I thought about what I would have to carry if something happened to her, if Devon did what men like Devon eventually do, and I would know that I had this envelope in my desk drawer, and I had done nothing with it. She pushed the envelope an inch further toward him. "I don't want that to be what I'm made of," she said. "Whatever else happens." He nodded. "There will be questions," he said. "From investigators, and possibly from attorneys. Your role in this is going to be examined. I know. You understand what that means for your position here. And I understand." She said it without flinching. "I've understood that since I walked in this morning, and you came anyway. I came anyway." She picked up her clipboard, stood. "I'm going back to the floor, and the store opens in 20 minutes, and someone has to make sure the registers are counted." She paused at the door. "I'm sorry it took me this long." She left. He sat alone in the manager's office, looked at the envelope, and thought about the letters he'd received 3 months ago. The 4 different people who had written to him because they didn't know what else to do. The church bulletin with the careful handwriting, "Please," before it is too late. He thought about all the Tanyas, and in every store, in every company, in every institution where someone was being hurt, the people who knew, who could see, who had done the math on what seeing would cost and had chosen the cheaper option, and, not because they were evil, because they were afraid. Because the economics of not knowing were for a very long time more survivable than the economics of knowing. He thought about being 14 in a hallway, and he thought about telling himself for 30 years that there was nothing a 14-year-old could do. Then he picked up his phone and called the detective Garrett had been working with. "We're ready," he said. "Whenever you need to move." Devon arrived at 11:40, and Garrett texted from the parking lot. "He's here. 2 officers with me. Detective Simmons en route 5 minutes out." Duran was at the customer service desk. He watched Devon come through the automatic doors, the same entrance, the same ease, and the same quality of a man who had never once walked into a room and felt uncertain about his welcome in it. He picked up a basket, moved into the store, and his eyes moved across the floor with the familiar scanning quality, looking for Zara at Register 4, and finding Rosa instead, a woman from the afternoon shift who'd been called in and who Devon did not know. And Devon stood for a moment looking at Register 4. Then he walked to the customer service desk and told Lawsonson he needed to speak to the manager. Lawson told him the manager was occupied. Devon said he'd wait. He waited 7 minutes. Standing at the counter, checking his phone, and looking at the door, not anxious, precise. The posture of a man who has come to conclude something and is giving the conclusion its appropriate lead time. Duran came out of the manager's office, and Devon looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The store moved around them, and a Saturday morning crowd, and cartwheels on tile, and a child asking for something somewhere in the cereal aisle, and the normal sounds of people doing the normal things people do on Saturday mornings. "And she's not here," Devon said. "No," Duran said. "Where is she?" "Somewhere you're not." Devon's jaw moved. Just once. Something underneath the ease that the ease was containing, and not quite successfully anymore. "And you don't know what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done. You've interfered in something private, something between 2 people that you don't have the context to understand." His voice was still controlled, still the reasonable voice, and the voice designed to make the person it was directed at feel like they were the one being unreasonable. "You've known this woman for 9 days. You've heard one side of a complicated situation and decided you have the full picture. And I have your emails to Tanya Brooks," Duran said. Devon went still. "I have the original incident reports before she amended them," Duran said. "I have photographs." And I have 14 months of footage from the camera you installed in the apartment, obtained under a valid records request issued this morning by the Fulton County DA's office. The ease was gone, not replaced by panic. Devon was too controlled for panic, but the architecture shifted the visible adjustment of something that had been built on a particular discovering that the foundation was not what it had appeared to be. And that footage is private. It was obtained legally, Duran said, and what it contains is not private. What it contains is evidence of criminal witness intimidation in a civil case from 3 years ago. Curtis Webb. You remember him. He paused. The footage shows that conversation, and all of it. That charge exists completely outside of anything involving Zara. It cannot be explained away by any document she signed. It cannot be attributed to her instability or her unreliability. It is you, and in your kitchen, on camera, in your own words. Devon looked at him, the look of a man recalculating everything simultaneously, running the variables, finding the exits, finding that the exits he'd built into every previous version of this situation were not where he'd left them. And the video I have, Devon said. The breaker footage. Send it, Duran said. Please. Send it to every journalist you know. And I will send a press release that explains exactly why I was in that store, exactly what I found, and exactly what has been happening to an employee of mine for 18 months. And then we'll see which story people find more interesting. Silence. The automatic doors at the front of the store opened. Garrett came in, 2 uniformed officers behind him. And behind them, Detective Simmons, who had the walk of someone who had done this enough times to find nothing about it dramatic. Devon turned, saw them, that one moment, and that single visible crack in the architecture of a man who had spent years ensuring he was always the one who controlled the room. And the detective introduced himself, presented credentials, and explained in the measured language of procedure that Devon was being detained for questioning in connection with a criminal witness, intimidation, inquiry, and that additional charges were under review pending examination of recently obtained evidence. Devon looked at the detective and looked at the officers, looked at Duran. He said nothing. He was intelligent enough to say nothing. He let them put the handcuffs on without resisting, because men like Devon understood that how you looked in a public moment was a resource to be managed, and he kept his face controlled, his posture straight. But as they walked him toward the exit, he turned his head and looked back at Duran, and what was in that look was not rage, and it was the specific, precise fury of a man who had believed himself to be unoutmaneuverable and had been outmaneuvered, who had built a system so carefully and maintained it so thoroughly that he had stopped being able to imagine a version of events where the system failed. And he hadn't imagined anonymous letters. He hadn't imagined a CEO who would give up his office and his dryer and his corner view and come stand in a grocery store in paint-stained jeans to look at what was actually happening. And he hadn't imagined Tanya Brooks walking in at 9:15 with an envelope. Duran held his gaze, didn't look away. The automatic doors closed. The store continued around him. Cartwheels on tile, and the child in the cereal aisle who had been asking for something had apparently gotten it because the asking had stopped. And a woman at the deli counter was placing an order for something specific that required several clarifying questions. Normal morning, normal store. Noel was at register 3, and he'd been there all morning, and working his shift, and doing his job, and glancing toward the front of the store every few minutes with the specific watchfulness of someone who knew something was building and had decided not to look away from it. When the officers left with Devon, Noel watched the door close and then turned and looked down the floor and found Duran, and he held that look for a moment. Then he nodded, not a small nod, a deliberate one, the nod of a man who had been standing next to something for a long time and had finally made a decision about it. Duran nodded back. He drove to the hotel at 1 in the afternoon and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, not because he didn't know what he was going to say, but because he wanted to say it right, and because she deserved to hear it clearly, without management, without him shaping it into something more comfortable than it was. He went up to the second floor, knocked on the door of the room Garrett had arranged. She opened it. She'd been awake. And the room had the particular quality of a night spent in the kind of alertness that doesn't allow for sleep clothes from the day before. A takeout container on the small desk, her phone face up on the bed where she'd been watching it, and she looked at him. He said, "It's done." She looked at him for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed. Not dramatically, just the way a person sits when something they've been holding for a very long time is no longer necessary to hold, and he sat in the chair by the window. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it did, moving, continuing, indifferent to the specific gravity of particular rooms in particular hotels where particular people were finally exhaling. "And tell me," she said. He told her, all of it, the footage and what it showed, the witness intimidation charge, and the fact that it existed independent of her, independent of anything she'd been through, a charge that Devon's influence and Devon's connections and Devon's document had no purchase on. He told her about the emails Tanya had brought, about the original incident reports, and she listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The document I signed," she said, "and our attorney filed a motion this morning to have it invalidated, given the evidence of coercion, given the footage, given the pattern across 3 relationships it will not hold." She looked at her cast. "The Memphis woman," she said, "and Birmingham, and Garrett is going to reach out to both of them. Now that there's a real case, now that there's something to offer them beyond a request to relive something terrible." He paused. "They get to decide, and he'll ask. But the case doesn't depend on them. It's strong enough without them." She nodded slowly. "Tanya," she said. "She came in this morning before the store opened. She brought everything she'd kept for 18 months. He paused. "She didn't have to. Nobody forced her. And she came because she'd been standing at the edge of it for a long time and she finally stepped." Zara was quiet. "I always knew she knew," she said. "I never once expected her to say anything. And people surprise you sometimes. Not usually." She said it without bitterness, just the precision of someone who had learned to calculate accurately. Then, but sometimes, a knock at the door. They both looked at it. "That's probably Brianna," Daron said, "and she texted Garrett this morning when she crossed the state line. She's been driving since 6. Zos stood, looked at the door. Something moved across her face that he hadn't seen before. Not the professional surface, and not the careful assessment. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been surviving so long it had almost forgotten it was more than survival." She opened the door, and Brianna was 22 years old, and she had her sister's eyes and a travel bag over one shoulder. And she looked at Zara for about half a second before she dropped the bag and put her arms around her sister in the specific way of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was finally allowed to show it. And Zara held on. Daron looked at the window, at the Atlanta afternoon, gave them the room. After a while, Brianna looked up and saw him and said, "You're Daron Ashby. Yes, you own the store. Yes." And she looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment of a 22-year-old who had just driven 4 hours to get to her sister and was in the process of deciding whether he was part of the problem or part of something else. "And she told me about Daniel Webb," Brianna said. "Daniel Webb doesn't exist. I know. She figured that out around day 3. Brianna looked at her sister. Something passed between them. She kept going back anyway. He looked at Zara. Zos looked at the window. "And I need to call my sister on Sundays and actually tell her things," she said. "To the window, to the room, to herself, maybe, as much as anyone. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not spending all my energy surviving." And she paused. "I need to understand the legal process and not have someone else manage it for me. I want to be the one making the decisions about my own life." "Understood," he said. "I'm not saying that to be harsh. I know you're not. And I'm saying it because I've spent 2 years having every decision made by someone who told himself it was for my own good." She looked at him. "I can see you doing the same thing, and with slightly better intentions. But the same instinct," he held that. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right." Something in her voice that was almost dry, almost the beginning of something lighter. "I've been right about things for a long time. I just didn't always get to say so." And Brianna looked between them. Then she picked up her bag from the floor and said she was going to find the vending machine and give them a minute, which Daron suspected was as diplomatic as Brianna got. And she left, and he sat back in the chair. Zara sat on the edge of the bed. The November afternoon came through the window, thin and pale and serious. "What happens to the store?" she said. "To register for. Whatever you want to happen," he said. "Your job's there. Your customers are there. And Mr. Beaumont comes in every Thursday." He paused. "But if you never want to walk back into that building, that's your choice too. I'll make sure you're okay either way." And she was quiet. I want to go back, she said. Not because I have to, because it's mine, because I built something there. She paused, and because Noel has been standing next to me for 2 years, and I think he might finally be ready to not look away, and I'd like to be there when that happens. He almost smiled. He testified this morning, Duran said. Voluntary statement. He called the detective's office himself. His aunt Zara looked at him. And he called at 8:45, Duran said. Before Devon even arrived at the store, he called and said he had things he'd witnessed and he wanted to put them on record. He paused. Nobody asked him. She looked at the window for a long moment. And people surprise you sometimes, she said. Sometimes, he agreed. 12 months later, the conference center off Peachtree was full. 200 people, and advocates, and HR professionals and legal practitioners, and a scatter of executives who had come because their companies had appeared in studies about workplace reporting failures, and they were trying to decide what to do about that. And the mayor's office had sent someone. The governor's office had sent someone. Several journalists were there with notebooks. Zara stood at the podium. She wore a dark blazer, no cast, no makeup covering anything that needed to be covered, and just her face, which had the quality of a person who had spent 12 months learning who she was when survival wasn't the only thing on her list of tasks, and had found that person to be more than she'd remembered, and she waited for the room to settle. Then she said, 14 months ago, I was working a register in a grocery store in Westbrook Mall, and I was good at my job, and I knew my customers' names and what they bought every week, and what their families were going through, and I was holding my life together with both hands. She paused. One of those hands was in a cast. The room was completely still. I am not going to tell you that someone saved me, she said, and that's not the story. The story is that someone stopped looking away, and that changed what was possible. Duran was in the third row. Brianna was beside him. And she'd moved to Atlanta 8 months ago, finished her degree remotely, and was working as a program coordinator at a nonprofit that had partnered with his foundation on a workplace advocacy initiative. And she was 23, and she asked more questions than anyone he'd ever met, and she had her sister's precision and none of her caution, which Zara had told him once was both exhausting and the best thing about her. And Brianna had her phone out, recording. On the stage, Zara kept going. The systems that should have protected me failed, she said. Not because the people in them were evil, because they were afraid, because looking clearly is expensive. It costs you the comfort of not knowing, and it costs you the protection of not being involved. It costs you the story you've been telling yourself about why it's not your place to say something. A pause. 14 months ago, several people decided that cost was worth paying, and some of them I knew. Some of them I'd never met. A woman in this city wrote a letter on the back of a church bulletin and pressed so hard the pen almost went through the paper. She looked at the room. I want you to think about that person, and about what it took for her to write that letter, about how long she'd been watching before she finally did. Duran looked at his hands. He thought about the letters on his kitchen counter. And the morning he'd stood there reading them in the clothes he'd worn to bed because he hadn't slept. The decision he'd made to go see for himself instead of routing it through HR. He thought about being 14 in a hallway, and not with the weight he'd been carrying it for 30 years. Just thinking about it. The way you can eventually think about something you've set down, it's still there. It still happened, but it isn't in your chest anymore. And it's in the past where it belongs, where it can be understood rather than just carried. He thought about calling his mother that morning, and she'd answered on the third ring, and same as always. And he'd told her about today, and about the conference, and about Zara on the stage. And then Loretta had said, in that voice unchanged since before he could remember, baby, you did the right thing. I'm not surprised, but I want you to know I know he'd been carrying that too, but differently. Zara was still speaking. I want to talk about the people who almost didn't, she said, because they're the ones who make me most hopeful. Not the people who found it easy to step forward, the ones who found it hard, who had reasons not to, and who had been looking away for a long time and had built a whole life around looking away. She paused. Because if those people can change what they choose to see, that's where the real change is. And that's where something permanent can happen. In the third row, Duran pressed his hand to his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure when he'd last moved it. The photograph had just stayed there over the past 12 months. until it felt like it had always been there, and until it stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like something else. Not a reminder of what he hadn't done. A record of who his mother was, who she'd always been, even when things were at their worst, and the laugh that came back, the woman who had survived and then built something with the surviving. He thought about what she'd said. You already know what to do. You just didn't have the tools then. He'd had the tools for a long time, actually, and he'd had the resources and the access and the ability to make things happen. What he hadn't had was the willingness to use them for something that was right in front of him and didn't show up in any quarterly report. And that was the thing he'd learned, not a new skill, a new direction for the ones he already had. And after the session, after the applause and the cluster of people who wanted to speak with Zara and the other panelists, Brianna drifted toward the refreshment table with the focused energy of someone who'd spotted something specific and intended to reach it before anyone else did. And Zara found him near the back of the room. She stood beside him, and they looked at the space for a moment. And at the chairs being rearranged, the podium being moved, the room already becoming something other than what it had been for the last hour. "How was it?" she said, "from where you were sitting?" "Like watching someone find out what they can do," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "And is that what it looked like?" "That's what it looked like." She was quiet for a moment. "Noel called me this week," she said. "He's been talking to some of the other employees, and the ones who've been there a while. He wants to put together a peer support structure, something informal. People who've agreed to actually look at each other." She paused. "He asked if I'd come in and talk to them sometime. What did you say?" I said, "Sis." She looked at the room, and obviously, he almost smiled. She turned to look at him, the full look, the one she'd been giving him for 12 months with varying degrees of what it contained. "And you should come," she said, "when I'd like that. You can be yourself this time, I'll try." Something moved in her face, warm, briefly unguarded, and the look she got sometimes now, the one that came out when something caught her off guard in a good way, the equivalent of the laugh he'd heard once in a break room and hadn't forgotten. Brianna appeared at her elbow. "There were good cookies," Brianna announced. "I saved you one, and both of you, actually." She produced 2 napkin-wrapped cookies from somewhere and distributed them. And then she looked between them the way she'd been looking between them for months, with the frank assessment of a 23-year-old who had decided to have opinions about this and was not particularly hiding them. "I'm going to get the car," she said, and left, and Zara looked at her cookie. "She's subtle," Duran said. "She's never been subtle a day in her life," Zara said, "and it's one of my favorite things about her." They stood in the emptying room. "Duran," she said. "Yeah, the photograph of your mother." She said it carefully. "The one you keep in your jacket pocket." He looked at her. "Call her more," she said, "not because she needs it, and because you've spent 30 years believing you owe her an apology you can't pay, and that's not what she wants from you." She paused. "I know because she told you herself, and you told me what she said." And he stood with that. "I called her this morning," he said. Something in Zara's face, the full warmth of it, unguarded and unhurried. "Good," she said. And they walked out of the conference center together, into the November afternoon, where Atlanta was doing its indecisive thing with the temperature, and the city moved around them, the way cities move, without waiting for anyone's permission, and full of people making 10,000 small decisions about what they were willing to see. And he would drive. They would find a place for dinner, somewhere Brianna had already identified and texted the address of, before they'd even reached the parking lot. And they would sit across from each other and talk about things that weren't the case, weren't the past year, weren't the distance they'd covered. Things that were just what came next. It would be ordinary, and it would be enough, more than enough, and the kind of enough that took a long time to find and that you recognized when you finally found it, not by how it announced itself, but by how quietly it arrived, and by how it felt less like an ending and more like the first day of something you hadn't known you were building. He pressed his hand to his jacket pocket, felt the photograph, thought about his mother laughing in a backyard, and thought about everything that had come after that photograph, and walked into the afternoon.